Dumelang, Tobela, Sanbonani. Hello, welcome back to Poetry Africa, and a warm welcome to a celebration of a very special literary journal that is also a brand new baby on our cultural landscape. Imbiza has partnered with the Center for Creative Arts to produce an edition of their journal that specifically concentrates on South African poetry and that also celebrates the journey of the last 25 years of Poetry Africa. So I'm here with the founder and editor, with the curators, with academics, writers, multidisciplinary artists in their own right. And it's my pleasure to introduce them to you, let me start with Ongezwa Mbele. Ongezwa Mbele is a poet, storyteller, theater maker, and researcher. She's currently a drama and performance lecturer at UKZN, and she's a PhD candidate at UCT. Her theater, poetry, and storytelling skills and ventures are centered on working with young people and children. She tells indigenous stories to children and adults who are interested in stories. She's facilitated theater projects and programs with young people from the township and also incarcerated people. And for her PhD research, she intends to analyze the representation of violence on stage done by township youth as a means of building and archiving the theater and storytelling performance efforts in the margins of South Africa. Welcome to you, Ongezwa. And welcome also to Nomcebisi Moyikwa, who's currently a mother to Kayone. Ongezwa was also a mother as well, and a daughter and a sister. Nomcebisi is a mom, is an artist, is a drama and performance studies lecturer at UKZN, the Pietermaritzburg campus. She was born and raised in Mahala. Her artistic practice is a movement towards developing conceptual spaces to think about creative expressions of Black South African artists. Her research interests are on the dynamics of cultural production, pedagogy, arts, and community. And Siphiwo Mahala, the founding editor of Imbiza, is an author, is an accomplished storyteller, is a novelist, is a playwright, is a literary scholar. He's the author of several books, and he's the founder of the Imbiza Journal for African Writing. His latest book, Can Temba, The Making and Breaking of the Intellectual Tsotsi, is an appendage of his PhD thesis, which he graduated from UNISA in 2018. He's held research and teaching positions at the University of Johannesburg, University of Pretoria, University of the Witwatersrand. He's also, once upon a time, a technocrat. He also worked for government, but did much actually to promote the arts when you were within government as well. So we have creatives who wear many hats, who know what it is to move between institutions, and who understand artists who do that. And I think that's very much what Poetry Africa has been about for the last 25 years. What is really interesting about this festival is that the expansiveness of what it means to be a poet in South Africa, specifically on the continent and in the world, is held by this festival. Every permutation of poetry is allowed to exist and flourish, no matter, art forms that are still in their infancy, things that are at the cutting edge, and things that are centuries old institutions in our cultural landscape. All of them have a home here. And we see that reflected in the journal as well, which is very exciting to see, as a writer, as a performer, as an artist, watching the death of arts journalism, seeing how a lack of critical engagement with the arts has enabled the environment that we now have in the arts. You look at what COVID has done to us and how there is a struggle for the general South African population to find a language to understand what this trauma actually is, because how do you value something if no one has taught you how to value it, and this is what I feel like Poetry Africa has done, and what this journal attempts to do is it features academic writing. There are features, there are articles, there's poetry, there's articles written by the poets themselves, there's articles written about the poets. So I guess I'd like to start off by asking you, Siphiwo, 25 years of Poetry Africa. What is the highlight for you of this festival in terms of what it contributes to the landscape, and how have you captured that with Imbiza?
Yeah, thanks, Lebo. Well, I might ask the same question to you, because you and I have been regulars at this festival for at least 15 years. The very first time I attended poetry.
18 years.
Well, I'm not exactly a poet, so it's understandable with me. My maiden visit to Poetry Africa was in 2005. And every year, when I think, they did their best, they keep improving, they keep getting better, and they're always relevant. And for me, I think that is the highlight, that they are in tune with what is happening. Any institution that is bestowed with the responsibility of developing and celebrating the arts needs to have its pulse, its finger on the pulse of the nation. And I think that is what the organizers of Poetry Africa have done over the past 25 years. And that's what makes Poetry Africa forever relevant.
Nomcebisi and Ongezwa have been brought in specifically as curators for this particular edition, is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
That's very exciting, because both of you are, you're writers and you're academics, but you're also active within your own creative practice. And I appreciate the fact that there are artists who have been profiled who, like you, also have their hands in many different aspects of creative life. Maybe Nomcebisi, can you talk about that? Because you in your bio, I saw that there's a part where you speak about being anti-disciplinary, which is quite interesting. I like that, this kind of fluidity of movement. But that's also, again, housed in this collection and also housed in the nature of the artists at Poetry Africa.
Yes, hello, thank you. I think, first of all, I think for me, as I always say, that when I entered as a person who was an academic, obviously at the UKZN, and also a person who's really interested in the body and movement, right? And for me, having engaged in creating works, and I say anti-disciplinary because what I've done is exactly, I've done what poetry allows us to do, to expand ourselves into and knock in different doors, right? And be able to say, hey, I'm here, I'm here. So this kind of expansiveness. And I think then the most important thing is to see the artist in action in that expansiveness. So that, and then the important thing for me is to, exactly what you're saying, is to see how we can create a language that could hold this and create a language that values it, right? And at the moment, what we see is that we create a language that tends to explain it, and I'm sort of interested in the expansiveness. If you're looking at the actioned artist and what actually they do, there is a language there. And even if it's with these 5-10 hands of mine doing this, there is something that's doing this. And for me, then to create a language that values the thing that does this, so that we don't just call it multidisciplinary, we call it a way of doing us, right? In a way of who's born in all our multipleness. So that's what I appreciated, to have an artist reflect and write and do the practice of writing about their practice and giving it a language, and for us to read that language and possibly continue it, because the progression is what is important, as you can see with Poetry Africa, the progression, how we're progressing. Rather than start, how we progressing, then we see that progression, in progression, you are, you expect the multiplicity, because then there's a stillness, there's a song, there's drums, there's a beat, there is an interruption, there is a difficulty. So you expect those things, they don't come as a shock, which is why for us, even the care that was happening, that held that multiplicity, nothing came as a shock. Everything was expected as we're moving. Thank you.
I love that so much. I mean, that idea of fluidity of movement also is exemplified by the use of language in the journal and by the use of form in the journal. I'd like to pose this question to Ongezwa about the importance of Imbiza being a multilingual journal. You've got Imbongis like Zolani Mkiva and like Jessica Mbangeni, writers who write in indigenous languages and English, somebody like Vangile Khanchu. You've got writers who write in English. You've got Pan-African writers as well. Talk to us about the importance of multiplicity with regard to language.
I mean, it's vital, right? Because for people to speak their mother tongues, to speak in their language, to think in their languages is a whole resistance. And so with the dominance of English and other, and other European languages that have landed on our palates and on our tongues, to speak and curate is a responsibility that we need to have in terms of indigenous languages. And when you curate, and this is the one thing in the journey, where we found there were a lot of English poems, right? Mm-hmm. And it is, and people then started going, no, you have to weed people out, right? Because they are there, but the system puts them in the margins. People are working here. I go to poetry in KZN, young people are speaking poetry in Zulu.
And have hundreds of thousands of followers on Instagram and fill up shows and are able to sustain careers writing in isiZulu.
So the responsibility for curators and journals is to go out and find the people. And we had to do that, and that for me, that's the disruption, because English comes easily, and it's that easiness that is also quite violent. And there's something in, and what comes up also, this longing for healing in the journal, people trying to find themselves, decolonizing self. There's one article about that, and that is part of also speaking your mother tongue. Ukanyi, there's one poet who, when we're editing her Xhosa Zulu, even that effort for me was beautiful, because I was like, what are you trying to say? She's like, no, I was trying to speak his Xhosa, and I'm like, oh, but you speak Zulu. And that effort, that disruption is necessary.
And it's how we live in this country. We move between worlds, we move between cultures, we move between languages. Like the archives that capture our lives should also reflect that. I appreciate that very much. I appreciate also the fact that you said that is a journey of resistance, because you start off Siphiwo by writing about how the landscape of poetry over the last, I guess since 1994, we're celebrating 25 years of Poetry Africa, but Poetry Africa would not be possible had it not been for 1994, and you very eloquently and clearly state how the first two presidents of South Africa in meaningful ways brought poetry back into the mainstream, and that created an enabling environment for Poetry Africa to thrive. But that was a way, and in reflecting on that, I think about how poets like, Don Matera, poets like Kyorapetu Khositile, poets like Mazizi Kunene, these are people who were banned, who went into exile. Like the radical nature of seeing South Africa's first Black president with an Imbongi on stage, like we take it for granted now, but it's actually huge. Can you talk to us about that, about resistance, about centering poetry as a resistance project?
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, no one epitomizes that more than Mazizi Kunene, who in his almost 30 years of exile, continued writing in isiZulu consistently. So it was fitting that after 94, when we had what we call the National Poet Laureate for the first time, he was honored with that title because he's quite deserving. He, against all odds, I mean, he continued writing poetry, and specifically in isiZulu. And as you say, at some point, poetry was thriving. We took things for granted, I must say, that the fact that it was championed from the highest office in the land, and there was, to some extent, respect in the sense that poets graced the highest platforms. But over a couple of years, I've learned, for instance, that when you invite a poet to perform, they must submit the poem that they'll be performing in advance. And I think that is stifling, the poet's voice, So yeah, I think, having this whole movement that people on the ground, were pushing poetry, and also you had, in the high echelons of the country, the politicians also honoring poets the way that they were doing, was actually a great atmosphere for poetry to thrive.
I think there's a conversation there about the commodification of the arts and about the necessity of using culture as a healing tool, like you said, Ongezwa, and having creating an enabling environment for people to be able to access culture because we understand the intrinsic value of culture. That versus the commodification of culture, the commodification of artists, and now artists having to enter the marketplace, having to work for, the what you're talking about, Siphiwo, about artists having to submit their work ahead of time. I have been working as a poet and as a commissioned writer for 20 years. I would not do a gig where I had to submit my work ahead of time. But I also understand that in an environment where you have a government that is now threatened by freedom of speech, that they would ask for such things, as opposed to a government that is saying, we invite criticism, healthy engagement is important to us, hearing what you think, putting different ideas out there is important, When it becomes a commodity, or when you have a government that needs to protect itself and insulate itself against criticism, then that is the anathema to freedom of speech. But still, Poetry Africa thrives. Still, throughout all of this, throughout the Zuma years, throughout the nonsense we've been through, throughout COVID, writers are still writing, people are still creating, the arts are still essential, I want to ask both Ongezwa and Nomcebisi, there's a developmental nature to the way that this journal is produced. A lot of the articles are written by master's students or PhD candidates. You have writers writing about themselves and their own experiences. I saw a piece written by Stella Nyanzi's keynote address is here, which is fantastic, and I want to come back to that. You've also got a first-person narrative written by Gabo Mu about his journey into poetry as a musician, Bonani Bila, who has been an academic and a poet as well. Can you talk to us about the inclusion of, or this partnership between UKZN and academics and emerging academics in particular, because these are candidates, it's not like seasoned academics who, some of them are seasoned, there are a few seasoned academics, but creating a space for people who are working on their degrees to also be able to write is very exciting. It's new, it's fresh.
Okay. Yes, I think it was Siphiwo. I'm going to speak basically on the book reviews, because that is also a point where I was focusing on, where Siphiwo he needs even postgrad students to write those. And he was insistent, right? And for me, sometimes you don't expect someone to say those things. You don't expect to hear someone who's willing to, I don't want to say bet, but who's willing to not just let learning become a process that happens after you've gotten the degree, because usually there's a job. You have a teaching experience. It's, oh, hi. If someone would have allowed me to practice, maybe I would have had the experience. So for me, it's an important thing to not just trust the kind of to hold our trust and how we develop just on the things that we produce, but also to start by really emphasizing on practice, because I think sometimes we're sitting down and you're writing down and you don't know who's going to read this or not, and you're afraid to share the work. And for me, this is a moment where people are actually sharing in so many different ways, that you share yourself, and you're sharing with whatever you're receiving from the other person. So with the master students, there were 4 of them, Utobile Mapanga, Talent Ndlovu, Nosizwe Hlophe, who were doing the kind of the poetry reviews, which for them it was like a daunting experience in the beginning, because again, I deal with the body. You can feel when people are reluctant with their voices, and for me that is the most painful thing to hear someone being reluctant with their voice, because there's a certain way, Ongezwa spoke about the palette. There's a certain way that they understand the kind of palette that is usually accepted, right? And so what you do then, you become reluctant with your voice. And for this process, for me, it was not even a manner of trying to correct them to go, here, read as a way of also of engaging, as a way of also of seeing yourself. If you have to reflect on Talenta's writing on hello goodbye by Koko goodbye by Putuma, and how she was engaging in it. She's engaging it as a young Black woman who is also talking about the erasure of other Black women, and how who's also experiencing someone digging them, right? And experience also that digging is a possibility. For me, that is it. If you have to teach lessons, they are doing lessons. Digging is a possibility. So Masieni, that is that's my 2 cents.
Digging is a possibility. I love that. Ongezwa, your take, please, on what it means to have these students and people, postgrad students contributing their work to this journal.
I think, so we focus on the postgrad students, but which Nomcebisi held their hands through the journey. What then became interesting is when the knowledge happens beyond just the university, right? The university doesn't produce knowledge. Abantu who produce knowledge. So when you have the likes of Paige writing about their journey in Poetry Africa, and I'm an audience member watching this, constantly coming to Poetry Africa festivals, I'm like, who's this boy? Man now does slam poetry and organizes young people and different spaces, right? And he reflects, and he also organizes the Sundowners poetry at the Playhouse. So I'm like, who's this boy? Who's this boy? It's like, and in the journey, I was like, Paige, you must write. And then I see him at the theater, and I'm like, geez, you must write. Okay. And then we go through the journey. Flo, a Black woman publishing, right? The one thing that she says, and organizing, right? And the beautiful journey that started to happen with this journal is the alignment. Then Flo published one of Praline's book, Wildest Roots. And then it was reviewed by Toby, like postgraduate.
Wow. So
there's an ecosystem that starts to happen of knowledge creation, of lineage, of continuity. Flo, I met in a theater festival in Port Elizabeth, right? And there, where is Zabalaza, still organizing, open hearts. So for me, that was the beauty of this work and this ecosystem that I kind of found myself in and curating and being an audience member, being a participant, being a theater facilitator, and the interdisciplinariness of it started to happen organically, because sometimes you don't have to curate it. And so it's to acknowledge that the knowledge is happening beyond the margins of the university. People are creating work. And the most beautiful thing that Flo says in her reflection piece is, I was with people who had PhDs when I'd go to these events to try and actually engage how to publish. And that moment shifts it. Like it's those tensions. And to understand that knowledge happens beyond the university structures, and we are engaging together as communities.
Yeah,
Thank you so much for saying that. I'm sorry, did I cut you off? Please.
No, I think I was going to add, because I think you spoke about the commodification of the arts, and I think what happens in the market, what I call it, in the market, the spatial vision of our culture becomes very narrow, right? And I think what then poetry reminds us on the everyday is that the spatial vision is big. Vulana mesh. So then how does then, not when we're producing, how do we make these things sibone? How ungena kokwenu uthi iqhanti and my poem, how do you gift that, right? Kokwenu, right? Because that's where another way of producing culture is happening, so that we open it up. And I think that's another task, to think about what poetry is allowing us and what is gifting us, and that for us to open our spatial vision so that all of this ecosystem and the continuity, so that they can happen elsewhere other than the market. So I think this is important.
I'm so thankful for this conversation. Like, just that idea alone, that knowledge production belongs to everybody who is engaged in the realms of creation, whether you are, and I'm so glad that you spoke about Page, because Page he's a spoken word artist. He comes from a hip hop movement and then grew into poetry, grew through the slams of Poetry Africa, has created platforms, has put other poets on, he has been a seminal part of the spoken word movement of Durban without having been published, right? I mean, that is extraordinary, that you can be engaged in. I mean, any writing is an intellectual pursuit. He is a writer. He just happens to share his work in another media, but this Poetry Africa's 25th anniversary has given him an opportunity to be published in #poetry, and has been given an opportunity for him to write as a knowledge producer in Imbiza. And I don't think there's any other platform that would take a young Black performer, artist like Page and position him in that way. And that is what is groundbreaking. That's what's exciting and necessary. I think that will go a long way to helping us as artists understand that we are in the business of making knowledge, and we're in the business of disseminating knowledge, whether we are conscious of it or not. I want to get into the comments before I come back to you and speak about, I want to come back and talk about lineages, because that's a big thing, that's a big current that runs through this entire journal, this edition. Ishmael Muhammad says, Siphiwo Mahala was an effective bridge between artists on the ground and government. That is very true. You were, the Brawili, of course, was, and one asks themselves, like, who is holding that kind of role right now? When you've got such a massive rift between what is happening in the state and what is happening to artists, like, who can step into that kind of gap? I wish somebody like Ishmael actually would step into that kind of gap. I think he would be perfect. I wish Ishmael could be Minister of Arts and Culture. That's now I'm saying it during the air to the ocean. Okay, back to the comments. Letung Kwanyana says, I was 6 years old and you guys were already working with Poetry Africa. Respect. Thank you, Letu. Ishmael says the role of the curator is to disrupt, which all of you have pointed out in different ways so well. Nomcebisi Becker, who will be emceeing tonight's performance at the Playhouse, says, what holders of space and spirit and growth you are. Thank you for that, Nomcebisi. Busisiwe Veronica Mahlangu says, yes, abantu produce knowledge. Abantu produce knowledge, Mbele. And one of the ways in which abantu produce knowledge is through resistance. Siphiwo, I'm so glad that you also chose to publish Stella Nyanzi's keynote address. I mean, reading that was just harrowing. Like, here's a woman who is speaking truth to power, an academic, an artist, you know, a creative, a mom, you know what I mean? On paper, she could be you, Nomcebisi, she could be you, Ongezwa, you know? Ends up in jail, courtesy of the state, you know, for writing, for telling the truth, basically, you know? Is harassed, her children are harassed. She's employed at the oldest university in iconic Makerere in Uganda. Her salary is cut in half by the government because of who she is and what she does and what she says, you know. I'd like to talk about how, you know, the connections between what somebody like Stella is going through now, you know, and what many South African writers have experienced historically, you know what I mean? What people like Radon, who you published here, went through when he was banned, you know? And at the same time, I mean, I don't think we can be too outward looking and think, oh, that's happening over there. Because we're in an environment where, you know, Sibongile Ngoma and Abahlali took over the National Arts Council for 60 days. Like, there's, you know, 300 million rand mismanagement, poets having to submit their poems ahead of time to be approved of before they can be set. So we're not really that far in a dystopian future. That could be a reality in South Africa, you know? Can you talk to us about that?
Thank you, Lebo. Well, first, let me just reflect on the developmental trust of the journal. Okay. You know, the first time I attended, or rather in my visits to various literary events, Nomcebisi Becker was still a toddler. You'd remember that very well.
That is so true.
It's so exciting to see her now actually writing for Imbiza and appearing alongside the likes of Don Matera. So if you're not sure about our developmental thrust, I think Nomcebisi Becker is one example of what we are trying to achieve. And now going back to, you know, what I've done in that editorial, I used a quote from Paulo Jordan, who as the Minister of Arts and Culture spoke for and promoted the voice of artists being respected. Taking from the traditional society where a poet was allowed to criticize even the king, you know, because it is the duty of the poet to be the conscience of the nation, conscience of the society. And that is what we are trying to do with this issue, where you have Stella Nyanzi, you know, who's been persecuted because of her outspokenness. And now in her keynote address, she puts emphasis on that almost every country on the continent has a constitution that goes the Bill of Rights, which guarantees the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, you name them. But the reality is that is not happening. So what is the duty of a literary journal in a situation like that? Other than to foreground, you know, to amplify the voice of artists, particularly dissident voices. And that's exactly what we're trying to do here.
Fantastic. Vangile, I'm just in the comments now. Aisha KG says, Yes, open up our spatial vision, open our inner eye. And yes, knowledge production happens beyond universities. It's part of us all, and we are all part of knowledge production. Vangile Avugile Khanchu also says, I think it's important to view Poetry Africa as a digital publishing platform. Decades of digital archives, carefully curated content. So Page is definitely published. He's archived. It's time to think of publishing as just on, the time to think of publishing, the time to think of publishing as just on paper is long gone. It's important still, but not the only. Thank you for that one. Lulu Makutu says, Ishmael for minister, yes. I think we must get that trending. Letoku Simang says, can we talk about mediocrity flooding Black creative spaces as a subliminal way of suppressing Black talent? You know, Siphiwo, you spoke earlier about how poetry was front and center and at the foreground, at the kind of forefront of the mainstream. I mean, I think that was very much the era that in which I emerged, in which Nziki Mazwai, Napo Mashiane, Maisha Jenkins, and so many others. I mean, you know, Natalia Mulibadzi, Malika Ndlovu, Makosa Zanakaba, they've been in the last, 25 years, like more Black women have published poetry than in 100 years before that, I think we saw a massive cultural shift happen post-1994 with regard to Black women in poetry specifically, and I think a number of things kind of happened at the same time. I think as the commodification of culture, which we've spoken about, right? The impact of mainstream media on the arts, and also the decline of public institutions like the SABC. You know what I mean? There used to be great shows like Head Rap and like Culture, right? Culture was given mainstream profile. Ordinary people were able to access culture, which is the project that Poetry Africa has been engaged in as well, like taking poetry into schools, taking poetry into prisons, taking poetry into the township, and then there was the shrinking of opportunities. And then there was the marginalization of certain art forms, and it seems that that has gone hand in hand with a culture of government in particular, silencing dissident voices, not actively silencing them in the sense that, no one is throwing us into jail like Stella Nyans, right? But silencing people by denying them opportunities, denying funding, denying access, denying resources to promote work, I think that's also one of the reasons why a journal like this becomes absolutely essential, because where else do those voices have a home? Who else is going to analyze that work if it's not going to be analyzed in such spaces, Which brings me to a critique that I have of this collection. And it's my only critique, but it's a big one. That for me, the most significant shift that has happened in the last 25 years with regard to poetry is the emergence of those Black women's voices. And there are Black women who have been profiled in this beautifully so. I mean, I love the Spogazi Jonas piece by Liduduma is exquisite, I think the curatorial hand in terms of also the poems that were selected by, like, to review Koleka's collection, which was stunning, and then still have like Jessica's work sitting side by Jessica Mbangeni as an Imbongi sitting side by side with Bangile Khanchu, who writes in multiple languages. I mean, there's a vision, that is quite beautiful, but I feel that there's a glaring absence of my generation of Black women writers who made an important impact when it comes to shifting this culture and centering poetry, And I'm asking myself, and you also, like, if we are not housed in a place like this, who's gonna house that narrative, Makosa Zanakaba just published a beautiful book last year called Our Words, Our Worlds, essays written by Black women poets who have emerged in the last 2 decades, So, I mean, I put that forward to you because you were there, you saw this happen, you know what I mean? And erasure doesn't happen by itself. It's like people get erased, people get taken out. We've been there, we've been creating, we've been working across mediums. I've never stopped working, So, I mean, that's my only criticism. If you would like to speak back to that, I would appreciate it.
Thank you. That's a fair criticism. We tried our best to be as representative as possible in terms of featured poetry. However, it was becoming a Bible. That's why I spoke to Ongezwa about it, to say, look, clearly we cannot feature every era, every poet that we would like to feature. So give me more space for the editorial, so I can give some sort of a reflection, particularly of the past 25 years and beyond, at least since '94. So that was part of covering the ground that I knew we could not cover in terms of the poems that we featured.
Okay. Well, it also means there's also space then for more editions and more journals that concentrate on poetry, on Black women's poetry, on
no doubt. Yeah. Look, Imbiza, first of all, in every issue we have a section for poetry, right? It was the first time that we got an opportunity to focus entirely, to dedicate the whole issue entirely on poetry, and it wouldn't have been possible without the assistance of Poetry Africa. And to me, there's usually an argument that poetry doesn't sell. Yes, if poetry is on stage, it's well and good, people want to watch, but they won't go to the bookstore and buy books. So when Ongezwa called me and said, can you collaborate? I had no idea how they wanted us to collaborate, but my first action was to say yes, because I know the history of Poetry Africa. I've worked with Ismail Mohammed, who's the director of the Center for Creative Arts, for the past 20 years. And coincidentally, 20 years ago, 2001, was the first time that I got my work published. It was the first time that I got to work with Mashile. It was the first time that I got to work with Ismail Mohammed. He still had black hair at the time, and he was somewhere in Witbank. So it was really exciting, because Poetry Africa has got that history, has got the captive audience that it does, and is always relevant. So I jumped at the opportunity.
Ismail Mohammed says, we start work on a digital archive in November. Phase 1 will profile every poet who has been at Poetry Africa for the last 25 years. Incredible, incredible. This will also provide indicators of themes, nationalities, countries represented, and funders of Poetry Africa over the last 25 years. This is wonderful. This is wonderful. Mo Africa Mkhati says, Volume 2 of this edition would further accelerate documenting many poets, organizations, and contributors in the margins of the poetry landscape working right now. People like Hear My Voice, who have been running technical for Poetry Africa for the past week. This is a poetry organization founded by young people, and they've been holding us together online. This is the second festival that they've been holding us together online. Shout out to you. Organizations like that. Halala, Imbiza Journal for African Writing, Mzuzugile Soni says, we need a part 2, then lest we erase awesome female poets. How much time do we have left? Oh, we still got lots of time. We still got lots of time. Let's talk about lineage. It was very nice to see how with many of the articles, continuities of thought exist, constant referencing of those that came before, whether it's Kabomu talking about the hip hop that he grew up with, that he internalized and read as poetry, Paige saying the same thing, Spogazi Jonas talking about her love of the Nomcebisi, but then seeing me and Chrisabani and realizing that she could make a career as a poet. Speak to us about these kind of literary lineages and how you've told these stories in this journal. All of you, any of you can answer that question, because I know that that's something that, artistic lineages, we wouldn't exist without our artistic lineages. And many times I think when you are made like an anomaly, you know. Everybody gets their day in the sun, right? And when they catapult you to wherever they catapult you to, it's often in the interest of the mainstream media or whoever it is that's catapulting you to make you feel like you are an anomaly, to make you feel like you're singular, you know. But practically every artist who you have centered here has spoken about their own lineage, from, you know, Stella Nyanzi referencing Nawal El Sadawi and Wale Soyinka, you know what I mean? To Koleka's book, where she lists a whole lineage of radical women, you know, who have been erased from popular narratives. So can each of you riff on this idea?
I mean, I don't think we curated that much. It came organically in itself because that's the African practice. That's the cultural practice. Asiyahambi sodwa. And we don't stand. And so when we stand with many. And when we speak with many. So for me, that was, we did curate it. It was, the idea was there, but it then, I mean, Siphiwo writes in your editorial when you wrote about Tatu Serote. And I'm like thinking, he was at Poetry Africa 2019, spoke to the, you were there, Lebo, or 2019 Lebo, you were there, or 2018, I got my data wrong. But they were there.
Even me, I thought that, the years
yeah, I spoke to the theater students, and then I'm like, okay, there's a spiritual element about it for me. And I can't touch it, but I know it's there. And throughout the conversations that I've been having in the book launches, that comes up. That Uvangile says, it's essential that we write about the women, our grandmothers. There's a movement of writing about these women that have been erased. And that is her form of healing. I just wanted to say that for me.
This is beautiful. We've got a lot of beautiful poets and creatives and thinkers as well who are watching this and who are contributing to the chat. I want to come over to you, Nomcebisi and Siphiwo, also to give you a chance to speak about lineage. But first, I'd like to just acknowledge Ishmael Mohammed says, catch the Poetry Africa anthology that will be launched in March. All women poets. Ishmael said as well during this festival that he has committed to releasing 2 anthologies a year, which I think is fantastic. We look forward to this. So the one coming out in March, all women poets. The anthology is published in partnership with the Stand Foundation and the Foundation for Human Rights. And then Spogazi Jonas, whose amazing film, #We Are Dying Here, we watched yesterday, who also has a wonderful profile in Imbiza that was written by Lidudu Mamalingani. That was one of my favorite pieces in the journal. She says, and she's the featured artist for Poetry Africa this year. She's performing tonight alongside myself, Kwezi Becca, Mam Tony Stewart. It's going to be an amazing night. Tando Fuze. She says, I've noticed that erasure, even in how we curate performance, even in how we curate performance spaces. Poets who are here working significant in the direction we are taking. We have living archives and we are not engaging there. Sis Malika has been instrumental for me in this regard. I've noted this in my own network and whom I recommend when asked to recommend poets. I've made a commitment to being intentional in sharing space with older poets. I challenge all of us who run spaces or produce productions to do better in this regard. Thank you for that, Spogas. Thank you for that. I think, and I think within, actually, let me leave what I think. Let me come to you, Nomcebisi, please.
Okay, hi. I think Ongezwa has already said that it was not intentional, but I think for you to notice that for me is to speak to the kind of the need for what you call the kind of artistic lineage, right? That there is a need for it, not just for, I think we think about it in the manner of, again, I'm always going to go back to the body. We're always thinking of a manner of the kind of the living archive, the books, the publications that we are producing, and the music we're producing, and in terms of that, recognizing that lineage. But also I want to put emphasis on what happens when you recognize that lineage in your body, right? What happens and the important nature of that in this specific moment where that's when you affirm and you're calling these people and remembering them, and the shift that happens in your body is an important thing that we have to take into consideration, because our bodies are needing that kind of calling, right? So that I can be able, my voice, so that I don't doubt it, because in the ayahs, and that as a practice, not just as a thing that we recognize so that we're afraid of erasure, but I want us to think about how we could take the doubleness of it. That is, and then we recognize what it's doing, but also we recognize what it's doing to us in our bodies right now, and how siyavuma, and this is how we're continuing ukubavuma constantly in our bodies, and how that is misa sitting.
And this is how you avoid being driven crazy by racism and by capitalism and by all sorts of other isms, by homophobia, I mean, it's what you were saying, Ongezwa. It's essential to what it means in the way that we define ourselves as Africans. When television was driving me crazy and mainstream media was driving me crazy, it was a refuge for me to have creative fellowship with artists, to be able to share space with people like what James Matthews, who, you know, in the 70s and 80s, is 80s now, 90 now, with people like Bobra Wili in their 70s, with people like Bobra Don in his 80s, with people like Mamgena, who have a vitality and a vibrancy of being and thought and spirit that they bring to the stage. The poetry space and the literary space, in terms of like, our space, the African literary space that is curated so beautifully by Poetry Africa. It is a house for that kind of multi-generational dialogue. There's no limit or ceiling or age limit, anybody can come and rock a crowd. I've seen 70-year-old poets stand up and rock a crowd. And for me, that as a 20-something-year-old writer many years ago, made me realize, I'm gonna do this forever. I'm here. For as long as I've got breath in my body, I can do this thing. This is not, it's like the antithesis of pop. You know what I mean? It's not an explosion that fades and dies. It's something that grows within you. And as you grow, the community grows. It is circular. It feeds you. It heals you, Siphiwo, you and I both had the privilege of sharing copious amounts of time with Georapetso Khositile, and I mean, that has been one of the greatest gifts of my life. It's been such an important part of shaping my intellectual life, my creative life, my approach to the arts, So please, I mean, whenever I think about lineage and I see you, and I immediately think of Brawili, as well as many other artists that I've shared the space with at Poetry Africa. But when I see you, I think of Brawili in particular. So can you talk to us about lineage? There's also so many people that you mentioned here in the journal as well. But AC Jordan, I mean, you spoke about Mazizi Kunene earlier, but we didn't come from nowhere. Poetry Africa is a long creative institution in terms of South Africa's, the lifespan of what is possible or what has been possible in South Africa. 25 years is nothing to balk at. It is huge for creative institution, but we come from massive intellectual and creative institutions in the form of people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for me, artistic lineage came sort of both organically and intentionally, because we're very intentional about making those connections, drawing parallels, having the likes of Brawili, Don Matera, and the others as the giants on whose shoulders the younger generation climbs. That is why you would remember, Lebo, I've hijacked you a number of times. When you go to perform at the National Arts Festival in Makanda, I would drag you to the township to go and do a workshop, in the community. And that's how you inspire, that's how you influence growth in terms of talent in the townships. And that's what defines me, and that's what defines Imbiza in that sense, that we're very intentional about creating that lineage. But also, someone like Brawili, for instance, is always affirming younger poets, especially.
Yes.
And
yes.
This is the trend that you find in the poetry space, that they are very conscious of their lineage, of taking someone with you. Don Matera, usually he has that thing he would say, when you say, "Oh, you must get set," before you go, look back to see who you can take with. And that is exactly what you are trying to do here. Thanks.
What is the way forward for the CCA and Imbiza partnership? Are we going to see more? I guess I can throw that out to all of you.
CCA bosses. Well, all I can say, I've been working personally with CCA for so many years. I think I've embraced their vision. And I believe that there's something common between the vision of Imbiza and the vision of CCA. And with the current director, Ismail Mohammed, we've worked together for so many years. I know what he believes in. I know what he's passionate about. And those who think he could make a good Minister of Arts and Culture, I think they're up to something. Yeah.
We must patrick him. We must hijack him and lock him inside the NAC building. Ongezwa, Nomcebisi, any closing comments that you have? I think we've got just a couple of minutes left, and we would love to hear from you.
Enkosi Siphiwo for saying yes. Thank you, Nomcebisi, for the teamwork. Thank you, Ishmael. Thank you, Spindile. And thank you, Hear My Voice. It's been a beautiful journey. I grew an inch. And I don't know if there should be more. You can't tell.
People want more. The chat is on fire now. Follow my paragraphs. You've got work.
It should be more. Yes, I agree. It's work. It's beautiful work. And I kept on saying, and I kept on saying to Siphiwo, and as the rush started to happen, I kept on saying, it's still beautiful, because what happens when you're creating and you're producing, and the anxieties and deadlines, you forget the beauty and the vision of the work. And I had to remind myself constantly, it's still beautiful. But
but if people are saying like, it's not enough, that's great, because it means that there's still more work to be done. There's more to be said. There's more to be challenged. There's more, there's more. It's an invitation. It's us saying, please feed us, give us. Oh, Sisi, Nomcebisi, sorry.
Thank you. No, I think, because I've been reading the comments, I think that the question on what do we do with the kind of mediocrity that works as a way to kind of devalue, other artists. And I think for me, and you spoke about the kind of lack of the non-existence of the depth of arts journalism. And I think with this kind of work, hopefully for artists to write about themselves, for artists to be written about, we can start to developing a way in which we can critique each other. So that mediocrity, so that when we know we're not saying your work is, we're criticizing your work because it's bad, it needs to be put aside. It's just that we know we are working on creating value of our work, and part of the work is writing about it and opening it up so that we can see, so people can also take time for growth and listen, right? So that other people can come in and continue those things. So I'm hoping with the kind of opening up of this kind of way of engaging, we can build critique in South Africa, so that We don't deal with people who really are writing sometimes mediocre things, but then because of, you know, the certain positionality, you know, they stay there, and because there is no real critique, people stay and producing mediocrity, and then the other people who are doing the work, they don't then get spaces to do the work. So I'm hoping this is the beginning of building that culture of critique, so that we can, you know, ground and value the work that we do, because it is valuable. And I want to say that I deliberately say I am Kayona's mom, because to recognize many places of knowledge, and being a mom is another place of knowledge for me that is very important. So to not just to also think about how poetry inspires how you think and how you open up spaces of knowledge for myself as I move forward. And that is one of the practices, to not just say academy, to say again was another space of knowledge where I'm coming from, and being a mom is also another space of knowledge for me, and that is very important. Thank you.
That is beautiful. That is beautiful, and it is very important. It is essential, and it is knowledge that is held in the body. I think that's what you spoke about that earlier, and Ongezwa also spoke about that earlier. I mean, I think when it comes to critical engagement as an artist as well, like, we invited, who else is going to analyze us? You know what I mean? I'm not going to be mainstream. The pop culture is not going to analyze me. It's not going to pick up all the layers and nuances in my work. It's not going to look at all the tools that I'm employing in my work. You know what I mean? The mainstream media is not going to do that. I mean, if African thinkers, scholars, creatives are not doing that for each other, who must do it? Must we wait for people who are doing MFAs from Germany to come and do them on us, and then take that knowledge there, never to be seen again? You know, how many academics have I contributed to in terms of my work, and boom, it flies and it's out. I don't benefit from it other than being held in some other canon that is not my own. You know, we also, I think we are inviting this engagement because we need it, because we acknowledge the fact that this is how memory gets preserved, and it's also because we want to be read by people who will understand all of what we are saying. You know, let me come back to the chat quickly before we close. I think we are just over time. Wait. Okay, Bangila Avugila Khanju says, it's so wonderful to see so many great artists and people engaging with this. I'm so happy for the people who have tuned in. Thank you. I know we're over Siavala. It's hugely critical to be mindful of who and what gets cut when space is the issue. A fair crit that requires careful reflection. Uguba, if we can't put everyone in, what or who do we value enough to keep? And if it is Black women who are lost, this is a mindset that we must be aware of and move on. And work on, sorry. This is a mindset that we must be aware of and work on, rather than accept as normal, Siyabonga. Black women have produced more written publications than any other grouping of people in this country. That cannot be discarded. Even when we speak of pre-1994 writing, we can talk about the men who wrote in exile and never mention the many works of Lindiwe Mazibuko or the poetry of Baleka Mbete. This is a serious issue. Also of the literary formations that existed prior to the end of apartheid, where women writers, many of them were marginalized, but those publications exist. I mean, the Back Center, at the very beginnings of Poetry Africa, used to host the Friday night big gala that would have been taking place tonight. And Nisa Malangi ran that space for such a long time. She's a fantastic poet. Women like Lisa Combrink, who ended up in government. You know, there are so many women whose creative lives were truncated by the misogyny of the literary space pre-1994, but their poetic voices are alive somewhere in the archive of memory of their bodies, of other people who remembered that time. So there's a lot of work to do.
So Lebo, that was meant to be Lindiwe Mabuza, not Lindiwe Mazibuko. It's a typo.
It was meant to be Lindiwe Mabuza. And I mean, the women of Kontwesi's were also put out a beautiful book last year called Malibongwe that includes Lindiwe's poetry. It includes Mambaleka's poetry. It includes a lot of poetry from that time and that era. That's a whole nother layer of analysis that needs to happen. It's been my absolute pleasure to moderate this discussion. Thank you so much for having me. Do you want to say bye-bye during the people, everybody, one by one? Siphiwo, let's start with you.
Enkosi kakhulu Lebo. There's still a lot of work to be done, and we are still around. We're up for it. Thank you so much.
Nomcebisi?
Ndiyabulela, enkosi kakhulu, ndiyabulela nakuwe, enkosi.
Thank you.
Ongezwa, Ishmael, everyone. Yo.
Yes, and the Hear My Voice team. Oh,
Yes.
wow. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's still a lot of work to do. We will show up. We need to sleep. But we'll show up. I'm here for it. I'm joking. But we are here. And Enkosi for the feedback. That is essential.
Well, bearing in mind that this was the third issue for me this year.
Well done.
Thank you.
Congratulations on a beautiful issue. I look forward to people reading it and having it in their hands. Again, it's Poetry Africa, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, Mfuleni, the last show. I think tickets are almost umper sold out there by the Playhouse. $180. It's going to be beautiful. All women lineup. You get to see our featured poet for this year's Pogazi Jonas, who also has a wonderful piece in this issue of Imbiza. And unfortunately, the Mfuleni show won't be live streamed. Yo!
No.
Okay, YouTube.
Yeah.
But we're gonna be there. We'll be there. And we're so thankful that you were here with us. Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you.